Yeah, I sent a PowerPoint along, so some of you might be able to look at that, but that's what I'm working on, is a PowerPoint presentation. I am a Crieff Rovers supporter. I started ministry replanting a church essentially in the Langton in Kirkcaldy in 1993. Stephen was a colleague along the road there in Dunfermline. I first came to Crieff, I think, through the kindness of Brock White, who I was the only free church minister in Fife at that point, and Brock kind of took me under his wing, and many of you would have known Brock and loved him. So great memories of that. I was a dirty blue nose growing up as a child, so I went to Ibrox every second week. I lived in a culture in Glasgow that was soaked in the kind of orange mentality. But as I grew up, I got really sick of that, and when I was in Kirkcaldy, I ended up being chaplain of Crieff Rovers, and decided that that was a very good opportunity for me to escape from the sort of Neanderthal world of being a Rangers supporter. So sorry to all you dirty bigots out there who still support Rangers.
Rejoicing with one sinner repents.
So on the book reviews, I've been in ministry 30 years. Haven't often felt like quitting, occasionally felt like quitting, often dreamt about retirement. And I can attribute to the fact that I've never quit. I want to pay tribute to a brethren elder. So there was an elder in Glasgow who was an elder in the local Brethren Evangelical Church. And he was the deputy headmaster at Broomhill Primary School, where I attended. And he was a vicious little man who used to belt us within an inch of our life. And I remember him, he used to pick me up by the ears. I remember him holding me by the ears one day, shouting in my face, "Are you a quitter? Are you a quitter?" And I was shouting back, "No, I'm not! No, I'm not!" And it's never left me. And, so therefore, I am not a quitter through God's providential use of a brethren elder in my life. So that's nice. I wouldn't name him actually, just in case. Anyway, so born in Aberdeen, grew up in Glasgow. I'm from a Christian home, and grew up in a very, very happy Christian home that was full of the love and the kindness of God and the joy of the Lord. Lots of laughter, lots of fun. My dad was a minister, and he had a real heart for lost people and was a very gifted evangelist. So I was thinking about this, what's church planting all about? And really want to start with this idea that church planting is not really about church planting. It's much more about mission and evangelism and our burden to connect the good news of Jesus Christ to the lost. So I thought I'd just start by reading a little bit of scripture from John 3, Jesus and Nicodemus. So Jesus says to Nicodemus, "You're Israel's teacher. Don't you understand these things? I tell you the truth, we speak of what we know, and we testify to what we have seen, but still you people do not accept our testimony. I've spoken to you of earthly things, and you do not believe. How then will you believe if I speak of heavenly things? No one has ever gone into heaven except the one who came from heaven, the Son of Man. Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the desert, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes in him may have eternal life. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life." So obviously super familiar words to all of us. I think that's John 3:16 would be the Bible verse that I heard more than any other as a child. And it was the verse that kind of shaped the attitude of my parents, the culture of our home, shaped the church that I was a part of growing up. That God loved sinners so much that he sent his one and only Son into this world to die for them so that they would not perish but have everlasting life. What an amazing truth to let saturate our hearts and our thoughts and shape how we want to live. So as I grew up, I had a real burden for people who weren't part of church, who'd never really encountered the Christian gospel. Most of my friends growing up, religion was a very alien thing to them. And so the question in my head was always around, how does the church begin to connect the gospel to secular, unchurched, post-Christian Scottish people? And I suppose I want to say that church planting is part of the answer to that. It's not the only answer, it's not the whole answer, but it is a really important part of what we need to do to see the gospel taking hold in Scotland again. So we had Tom Lenny's book reference as well on revival, and I kind of got a very free hand with this talk. Jerry just said an overview of church planting in Scotland, but as I was thinking about it, I've kind of called it church planting in not the revival of the church in Scotland, but the renewal of the church in Scotland. Because I think that's what we're longing for, is a fresh work of the Spirit, the new life being breathed into the church in Scotland. And I'm very much of the opinion, very strongly of the opinion, that church planting plays a very, very crucial role, not just in reaching people, but in helping to renew the entire Christian ecosystem in Scotland, breathing new life and bringing fresh energy, fresh ideas, fresh resources into the wider church. So I'll talk about that as I go on, about how as you plant churches, actually that feeds back into the wider church in lots of really beneficial ways. But that's my kind of basic thesis for you this afternoon, is that you may not plant a church. You may be ambivalent about church planting or cynical about church planting, and that's fine, but church planting is going to play a crucial role in seeing the Scottish church renewed. And as I grew up, as I tried to figure out what God's calling in my life was, then I really felt that God's call in my life was to help in whatever small way I could with the re-evangelization of Scotland. So that's my big picture life goal. How can I, in some small way, contribute to the re-evangelization of Scotland? And the focus I've given that in my life is church planting. That if I commit myself to church planting, I can play my small part in helping Scotland be re-evangelized. So if you've got my slides, you can see that I get to spend most days with a woman called Louise. So I'm married to Louise. We've been married for over 30 years. We've been in ministry together for over 30 years. During that time, we've been involved in planting 3 churches together. And Louise is a biblical counsellor, so she's got her own kind of ministry and her own stuff going on. But she's been absolutely central to everything that I've thought and done in terms of ministry. And we've got 4 kids. They're sort of 30 down to 19, 3 girls and a boy. They're all believers, none of them married. And it's been an amazing thing, I think, and most of you who I've known for a long time will say the same thing, just to see God's faithfulness in our marriages and to our children. And I'm thinking that the way I've got the laptop's cutting out the mic a little bit, so is it okay? Can everybody hear me? Yeah? Okay. Good. So right now I'm the minister of a church called Cornerstone. Cornerstone is in Morningside in Edinburgh, so it's a very nice place. You had a nice paper round. We planted Cornerstone in 2014 from St Columba's Free Church of Scotland. I was working for the Free Church at that time as what they called their mission development officer, helping equip and train leaders for mission. And I was at St Columba's Free Church, Derek Lamont, the minister there, had a vision to reach the city, and we together kind of came up with the idea that church planting would be one way in which we could begin to reach different parts of the city. So I took Cornerstone out. 12 of us who lived in EH10 began to meet together and pray together and eat together and dream together. We did that for about a year and a half on Wednesday evenings, just wondering what God might do with us. And then we launched in 2014. St Columba's has planted another 3 churches since then. The minister, Derek Lamont, is stepping down in 2 weeks. He's just turned 60 yesterday. And he's decided at the age of 60 it's time for a change of gear, step things up a little bit. So he's off to plant a church in Leith. So 60 years old. So that's one of my challenges to you, is you may be thinking it's time to wind down, but the Lord may be saying something different to you. You may be thinking, well, church planting's a young man's game, but the Lord may be saying something to you as well. The basic thesis I want to say there is, if I can plant a church, anyone can plant a church, okay? So don't worry about that. It's not particularly difficult. It's just ministry in a slightly different setting. So Cornerstone, we've been going for 10 years. We currently meet in George Watson's school on a Sunday morning in their music auditorium, which is very beautiful. A nice place to have your services. And we're in the process of planting 2 further churches. So we're planting a church in the Gilberton part of Edinburgh, South Edinburgh, which is one of these very fast-growing suburbs of the city. And then we are planting what we like to tell ourselves, and I think it's true, but I may be lying. You can tell me if I am. We're planting what we believe is the first ever Spanish-speaking church in Scotland. So, weirdly, with no planning on our part, we about 30% of our congregation is Hispanic, Latino mostly, South Americans, and we are planting a congregation for them currently. So that's a little bit just of my involvement in church planting. It's the air I breathe, it's the water I swim in, it's my kind of obsession, passion, focus, and my joy as well. I love what I do, and I love Cornerstone. It's a great church to be part of. It's been a wonderful thing. So, again, just back to my thesis, church planting has a crucial role to play in the renewal of the church in Scotland. I was invited at the end of last year to go and speak to the Baptist Union of Scotland about church planting. And there's a good anecdote just to share with you there, is that I'm very friendly with a man called Glenn Innes. He's the minister of Portobello Baptist Church. Glenn Innes is also the lead for Future Church in the Baptist Union. So he does their church planting stuff. So Glenn and I are good friends. And he's always asking me about 30 by 30. And 30 by 30 is a free church project to plant 30 churches by 2030, which I take responsibility for leading that project. So Glenn and I used to chat about that. And about a year and a half ago, the Baptist Union went away to sort of develop a church planting strategy and came back with the very catchy and dynamic ambition of 40 by 32. Okay, so we're doing 30 by 30, they're doing 40 by 32. But it's nice, isn't it? Just like that little way that people are playing off each other and seeing what God is doing and thinking, well, if the free church can do it, we can do it, and we can do it better. So that's really good. So the Baptists asked me along to speak about what we do. And just before I went, there was a headline, again in the Scotsman, exclusive headline. It says, Church Closures Scotland. Existential crisis as up to 700 churches predicted to close across Scotland by end of decade. Okay? I don't subscribe to the Scotsman, so I don't know what the article actually said. I couldn't click any further. But even the headline kind of speaks about the wider setting that we're operating in Scotland as we do ministry today, which is a backstory of decline and the shrinkage of the church in Scotland. My own denomination was in decline for about 40 years. The Church of Scotland has been in decline for a long time also. So there is that kind of background feeling of pessimism amongst many Christians and the inevitability of decline. So as we think about religion in Scotland today, how do we approach that? Well, one, we know the headlines are terrible. Two, the statistics at many levels are grim. But three, the gospel hasn't changed. And the gospel is still the power of God for salvation. And so I think that's the focus, is that if we're confident in the gospel, then the gospel will bear fruit. If we're preaching the gospel, declaring the gospel, ministering out of the gospel, serving the gospel will bear fruit. That's an unchanging truth that we can hold to. The gospel is power for salvation. And if you start to strip away the kind of headlines you get in the Scotsman or elsewhere, the underlying story of Christianity in Scotland is actually fairly positive. So even 10 years ago I heard a talk by a woman called, I think Grace Davies was her name. She was a sociologist of religion at the University of Southampton. She's retired now. But she was a liberal Anglican, she said, and in the 1960s, when she was starting her academic career, they thought liberalism would be the future of Christianity, that as culture shifted, they would move with culture, stay in touch, stay connected, stay popular. And she said in her talk, she says, but we were completely wrong, and that liberalism is dying, and that's what causes all these headlines of massive church decline. But what's not dying is what she called faith by choice. So faith by obligation, kind of cultural Christianity, she said, catastrophic decline. But faith by choice, according to their research, was growing. That included Islam, by the way. But she said it's mostly evangelical Christianity. There was a thing produced a couple of years ago now, maybe, on church growth. Somebody who blogs and writes in church growth. And there's a chart that I found. I wish I could show it to you. It's a really interesting chart, though. It's about annual change in UK church membership between 2015 to 2020. And it shows the rate of decline amongst denominations. The quickest declining denomination is the Welsh Presbyterians, followed by the United Reformed, Welsh Independents, Scottish Episcopal, Methodist, Church of Scotland, Church of England, Baptists, Salvation Army. And the graph shades all of those denominations in yellow as kind of more liberal than evangelical. The Church of Scotland, I think it shades in sort of orange almost, which is in the middle, apparently, of evangelical and liberal, similar size. But then the chart goes on to show Vineyard, Redeemed Church of God, FIEC, New Frontiers, Elim, and even the Free Church of Scotland as growing denominations, and they're all coloured in red for evangelical. Okay? So I think that's a great encouragement to every single one of us, if we're gathering here as evangelicals, is that the evangelical church is growing in Britain and prospering. And that gives us confidence to keep going forward in the work of the gospel. So the headlines might be terrible, but the reality is not quite the same. So if we're going to be on mission, if we're going to be doing evangelism, then church planting is going to be a really helpful part of our mission and evangelism as we seek the renewal of the church in Scotland. So rather than getting on the defensive when things are difficult, and managing decline, which my denomination did for decades, and as you try and manage decline, you just spiral into further decline. And I think that's part of the conversation that's happening in the Church of Scotland right now. But if you stop trying to manage decline and gear up for mission again and get back into an aggressive mission mentality and put evangelism at the forefront of what you're going to do, that's the best way, as we understand it, to deal with the decline in Christianity. So for church planting itself, I'm a strong advocate of church planting for three reasons. One is Scripture, I think, gives great encouragement and endorsement to church planting. Secondly, missiology would point towards church planting as being effective. And thirdly, our context, I think, has particular things going on within the Scottish context that make church planting a priority for us if we're going to see real growth in the church. And that's a lot to do with demographic shifts and changes, and I'll come to that later on. But of course, there are skeptics, there are people who don't like church planters and who don't like church planting and think that it's a waste of resources, lots of reasons that people criticise church planting. I would say in my own denomination, when I started really banging the drum about this very loudly about 14, 15 years ago, the level of scepticism was pretty high, and antagonism, not real antagonism, but just like real scepticism about what might be achieved and taking resources away from other things, and why start new churches when so many churches are closing, why don't we help strengthen the churches that are struggling rather than start new things. So all those questions kept coming up. And I think now as a denomination we're in a position where largely 90% of people are pretty much getting it in terms of church planting as a helpful thing to do. But there are skeptics out there, those who cry humbug, who think this is drivel, and who would say you've got this all wrong. So plenty of churches already is one reason. And if you look at Scotland, I'll say this later, but if you look at Scotland, there are plenty of churches still. I think currently we still have about one church for every 1,300 people, which is a pretty good ratio. So that's one argument, plenty of churches already, or as I've said already, no, don't send out people to do new things, strengthen what you've got, build up what still remains. Or we don't have enough leaders. So in my denominational setting, one of the issues often is, all the talented young guys are off planting churches. That's not the case. It's people like Ali Sewell who are planting churches, and Andy Robertson and so on. So the best go elsewhere, and we take the rest and turn them into church planters. So, you can tell Ali that from me. So no, we get a lot of gifted young guys, but still the majority of our young men go to rural charges in the Highlands, or settled charges. So it's a minority of our guys who are preaching in church or planting churches. But it does mean that we have to be much better at recruiting. And I'll say some of the challenges at the end. I'll wrap up with some challenges. And pipeline is always the big thing. Where are you going to find a church planter? And we started planning that about 12 years ago and creating pipelines so that we would have the planters we needed. And amazingly, God keeps bringing people like Ali, Andy Robertson, and many others, and they're doing great work. We lack resources, and we do lack resources in the Scottish Church. And so one of the things I'll advocate for is partnerships. Kevin's church in Matthews, North Carolina has funded quite a number of church plants in Scotland, or helped to fund quite a number. And there are a lot of American churches that are partnering with what's going on in Scotland in terms of church planting. So there are resources out there, and there are, of course, resources in Scotland. Some people think church planting doesn't work, and I think that's a very valid criticism. So as I spoke about evangelism, I think that that's what we try to instill in all our church planters, is you're not there to move people from one church to another. You're not there just to transfer his bum from that church to this church. We're there to reach the unconverted for the sake of Jesus Christ. Now, some church transfer occurs in the middle of that, but it's one of the things that's hard to measure so far, is how effective is church planting evangelistically, and we need to do more research on that. But I've got some figures that kind of point to a pretty high degree of evangelistic fruitfulness in the church plants. And certainly that's our own story at Cornerstone. Others would argue against it, that it's too much of a focus on new things. The world needs Jesus, not churches. Some people like large churches and think they're better. Some people would argue that it's not clearly commanded in the New Testament. Some people would say, we've already reached this nation and it's rejected God, what's the point? So there's a sort of defeatist mindset out there sometimes. There's a saying that used to be floated amongst church planters that was, the single most effective evangelistic methodology under heaven is planting new churches. That's by Peter Wagner, who's one of these kind of church growth theorists, natural church development, etc. The single most effective evangelistic methodology under heaven is planting new churches. And every church planting conference I went to for about 10 years, somebody would quote that. The question, of course, is it true? And the answer is probably not. So it's a bit of an overstatement at best. If you want to read a book in church planting in secular Europe, the best book to read is called Church Planting in the Secular West by Stefan Paas. He's at the University of Amsterdam. He's a missiologist there. He's one of the few people who's bothered to do good research on church planting in Europe that's recent. And Stefan Paas would say, one, you can plant churches where very little evangelism happens. But secondly, and more importantly, he says, age is not the most important factor in the growth of a church. So I'll say that again. Age is not the most important factor in the growth of a church. So if you're in a church that's been there for decades or hundreds of years, don't be discouraged. It's not being a young church that makes the difference. He says the two things that stand out are leadership and location. Okay, and the location, I think, is one of the contextual issues that really challenges us today. Plenty of churches, but mostly in the wrong places. So leadership and location are the key things in helping churches grow. And those are things that we can address quite easily. So there is a skepticism around church planting that we need to be realistic about and not make overblown claims for church planting. But at the same time, I'm convinced biblically it's very important, missiologically it's very important, contextually it's very important. So Bible, I think, is very clear, just at a simple level, to say that we believe that the church is at the heart of God's plan for this world. That the church is God's missionary strategy to reach the nations. So we go to Genesis 12, end of Genesis 11, everything's just full of despair. We're coming to the end of the line, it seems. Abraham, Sarah, no children, no hope, no future. Beginning of Genesis 12, God steps in a great act of grace with the promise of the covenant. I will give you many offspring who will be a blessing to the nations. And so God is promising to create a people for himself out of grace, out of the power of the Spirit, who will be a witness to the nations. And ever since then, we believe that's God's missionary strategy. Whether it's through the time of the Exodus, or Psalm 67, the great prayer, Lord, bless us that we might bless the nations, or whether we come into the New Testament and God's great covenant commissioning of his church in Matthew 28 to go and make disciples, and we know that disciples are made in churches. So we're not just making converts, we're making disciples, and people are discipled in the local church. So we believe the local church is God's plan A for mission, and he doesn't have a plan B. And then Acts gives us, I think, not a strategy or a blueprint for church planting, but it does give us an insight into what was happening in the early church and how the early church went about mission. And of course what happened is they did evangelism, people were converted, they were discipled, and they were formed into churches. And then these churches in Philippi or Corinth or Rome or wherever it would be would then do more mission and evangelism, and other churches would spring up in those cities. So some of it was just this pioneering mission by Paul and his team. Some of it then seems to have been local Christians doing mission in their setting to start further new churches. So we've got the commissioning of Barnabas and Saul at the beginning of Acts 13. The church in Antioch sends them off. In Acts chapter 14, we see them in different places, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe. And people are being converted in all these different locations as they do mission together. And we read down at verse 21, they've been in Derbe, they preached the good news in that city, they won a large number of disciples. Then they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch. And what do they do in these places? Well, they're circling back the places they've been on mission, and they go there to strengthen the disciples. So they want to strengthen the converts and establish them in their faith, encourage them to remain true to the faith. They told them, you're going to have to go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. And then they appointed elders for them in each church, and with prayer and fasting committed them to the Lord in whom they had put their trust. So that's a simple but clear pattern that we see in the early church of evangelism and mission, people being converted, people being discipled, and formed into churches with what we would recognize as biblical church leadership. So that's just at a very simple level. We know this is biblical. Missiological reasons for church planting. Stefan Pass's book is a really helpful book, and if you ever only get a chance to read one book in church planting, I would read that book, Church Planting in the Secular West. He kind of gives 3 reasons for church planting. First one he calls growth. Okay, so that's very clear and simple, growth. We want more people to be saved. We care about the lost. We're burdened for their eternal destiny, and we want to see them rescued from hell. So we care about growth. Second reason he gives is innovation. We need to learn new ways of doing mission as culture shifts. And church plants can be little laboratories where you can try new things out without a lot of resistance from well-established Christians and well-established church. And then the third reason that he gives, so growth, innovation, the third one he will give is confession. So many churches are planted out of a desire to extend the confession of their church and their brand, if you want to put it that way. And I think our motivation in church planting in the evangelical kind of world in Scotland is simply to see more and more evangelical churches across the nation. We have a lot of churches per head of population, but they're a very mixed bag. And my longing is that every community in Scotland would have a Bible-teaching, gospel-centred church that lives out the truth of Jesus Christ with love to their community. And my worry is that with so many church closures over the next 5 or 6 years, we're going to find villages, towns and regions where there is no real living Christian witness, which is an astonishing thought for us. And I'm sure places in Scotland where even civic Christianity is going to die a death. And no Christian weddings, no Christian funerals, no Christian baptisms, nothing like that going on. So we want the confession, not the confession of the Free Church, not even the Westminster Confession, but we want the confession, churches that confess Christ as Lord and Saviour, to be there in every community in Scotland. Missiologists will argue that small churches are better at evangelism than big churches, and certainly in the early stages of a church plant there's not so much pastoral work to do, and you can be really top heavy in mission. It's very freeing, it's great. We want to reach people who are culturally distant from the church. So, you get to your grandchildren's age perhaps now, like teenies. I think 2% of them have any connection to church now. So, my generation sort of knew about church. My grandchildren, I don't have any yet, but that age group, church, mystery, total mystery. And we know that the large majority, 80% plus of people in Scotland now have no live church connection. So that idea of reaching people who are distant from the church puts a pressure on you as you do mission and evangelism to be really clear in everything you do, to be transparent, making it easy for people who've never encountered church or Christianity or the Bible to understand what's going on. So you're always explaining things. You don't assume people have read the Bible. You don't just reference casually, Nicodemus, as if everybody knew who Nicodemus was. I had a guy recently, I said we're going to study Ruth at church tonight on Sunday morning. He turned up on Sunday night and he was quite intrigued. He says, "Who's Ruth?" And the only Ruth he knew of was Ruth Davidson, because he works at the Scottish Parliament. So and he's my age. So think about, the little ones who've never really heard anything. So, but what we find is, as we were trying to be really open and explain stuff clearly, somehow that worked for non-native English speakers too. And we ended up with all these Hispanics, because we were trying to make it easy to find your way into the church, into the community of the church, into the Bible, into the gospel. And just by trying to make everything really clear all the time and never assuming anything, the Latino people sort of found, okay, we can figure out what's going on here. It wasn't too culturally hard to navigate for them. I'm really fascinated to see what the next census is going to say about the changing demographics of Scotland, so looking forward to that. Missiology, churches, new churches reach new people, new cultures, new generations and new places. So again, the demographic shifts in Scotland. We're in Gilberton. I think there's going to be 4,000 new houses in Gilberton, 12,000 people. No church planned for that community, no community space planned for that community. What an opportunity. New cultures, Hispanic cultures, African cultures, Chinese cultures, the Hong Kong people who are coming, cultures that are distant from us, not because of ethnicity, but because of lifestyle, conviction, etc. And the great thing about this is, if you pour a lot of money into some ministries, you just have to keep pouring money in. But if you pour a lot of money into a church plant, hopefully in 5 or 10 years, most of the time, it will become a net contributor back into the ecosystem, and it will be producing more resources in terms of finance. It will produce new leaders and new money, and often new ideas. So church planting is actually, this is where I'm starting to say it's a beneficial thing for the renewal of the whole Scottish church. We're reaching people we wouldn't have reached otherwise. We're finding leaders we wouldn't have found otherwise. And we're finding money that we would never have got if we hadn't planted churches. So it's bringing fresh life, fresh ideas, fresh leaders, fresh converts, fresh money into the church for its growth. So church planting will bring renewal to existing churches. And I've got a great statistic I'll show you in a little while about how St. Columba's has pushed out planting 4 churches in 10 years. St. Columba's, the mother church, has probably doubled in size at the same time, because people are drawn to the church with its commitment and vision for mission. Existing churches are challenged and blessed by new churches. So just the challenge of, oh, they're doing that, well, we could do this as well then. I think that's a great thing sometimes. Well, the Free Church are planting churches. Well, we're the Baptists, we're going to plant more churches in the Free Church. So there's that kind of wider benefit. New energy, new hope, new growth, because mission does work and church planting is beneficial, and the gospel is the power of God for salvation. So those are sort of broad missiological reasons. The contextual reason, now it's really hard to count churches in Scotland, partly because sometimes you're being told about congregations where there are actually 3 churches, in that congregation. Or so how many churches in Scotland? It's kind of a moving target. It's hard to decipher. But probably around 4,000 churches in Scotland still. And they're estimating 3,000 by about 2030. 20 years ago, there was 6,000 churches in Scotland. So since 2002, we reckon 2,000 churches have closed across Scotland. And then best figure we can come up with, I've discussed this with other church planting guys, we think about 400 churches started over that period. And there's a good study done by an academic, Sheila Comia, who looked at new churches in Glasgow between about 2002 and 2016. About over 110 churches, most of them African or Asian churches, homogeneous churches for ethnic minorities, and very few sort of older Scottish churches planting. But nevertheless, we've seen a big net loss in the number of churches in Scotland. But that's not the huge issue, I don't think, is the number of churches. So in 2000, we would have had one church per 833 Scots. Pretty high. In 2020, around one church for every 1,350 people. And then we reckon by 2030, one church per 1,833 people. Very broad figures, but roughly there. So that's still not bad, is it? One church per every 1,800 people you'd think would be sufficient. But then you go and you see Tarbert Harris, or no, Leverborough. I think there was at one point 7 very, very similar Presbyterian churches for a few hundred people. I've worked out that in Portree, where a very good friend of mine, Donnie G. MacDonald, is the Free Church Minister, I think in Portree there is one evangelical church per 400 people. Harper Memorial Church in Glasgow did a study about 10 years ago that figured out there is, in the east end of Glasgow, one evangelical church per 30,000 people. So that's the contextual pressure to plant churches, is it's just our churches are in the wrong place a lot of the time. It's not that there's not enough churches, it's just they're in the wrong place. So even where we are in Morningside, we're in EH10, the council ward is 30,000 people. Now when we planted there was 2 evangelical churches for 30,000 people, and they were both at one end of the EH10 postcode. An Elam Church and Bruntsfield Evangelical Church. Then you could go 3 miles further out, you would come across 4 Church of Scotland's and 2 Episcopalian churches. So there was quite a lot of churches in the postcode and in the council ward. But if we were looking at churches of strong evangelical conviction that had a hope of growth, then it was probably just those 2 for 30,000 people, even in what's one of Scotland's most prosperous, well-educated and leafy neighbourhoods. Andy Robertson's going to come tomorrow and talk about church planting. He's with the Free Churches with 20 schemes. He's in Charleston and Dundee. 20 schemes have estimated that 0.45% of people in Scottish schemes are evangelical believers. So less than 0.5%. Now the broad figure for Scotland of evangelical belief is somewhere under 3%, 2.7 maybe, something like that. But in the schemes, it's just so much smaller. And they say that 2% of Gen Zers are evangelical Christians. So we're an urbanising nation. Scotland is becoming more and more urban. People are moving to the cities. Edinburgh's growing all the time, MLS or other cities as well. So that means we need to plant churches in urban areas, and it means we need to plant especially amongst the urban poor. So population, urban, we need mission that's urban because of population change. We need mission that is church-based because that's where disciples are made. And we need mission that's innovative because business as usual is not working. So does church planting work? Well, the last really good stats I've got from what we do is from just before COVID, so 2018, 2019. And we looked at 8 of our church plants. So I lead a little network called Generation Church Planting. We've planted about 25 churches over the last decade, largely free churches, but some FIEC and independent churches as well. So we looked at 8 of our church plants in 2019. There were 240 new people in these 8 church plants, and 81 of them were new to church. So that was, for us, a really good statistic, that about 30% of these people were new to church. When I planted Cornerstone, we were getting a growth rate of about 20% of people were brand new to church or de-churched. So we think we can, with church plants, reach people that nobody else is reaching. And that's part of the logic of church planting, is that if existing churches are failing to reach, then sometimes you need something new to make that connection. St. Columba's Free Church almost closed, so it's right in the Royal Mile beside the castle. It's our assembly hall, so it's just over from the Church of Scotland assembly halls. In 2000, we had a split. Most people left St. Columba's Free Church, and there were about 20 people left. Derek Lamont came from the Highlands of Scotland, from Invergordon, and took that on as a church revitalisation project. And he had a city vision. He believed that God had spoken to him and said, I still have many people in this city. And he wanted to create a church with a vision for the city. So over the next 10 years, St. Columba's grew from around 20 people to around maybe 150 to 200 a decade later. And then they started to think, how do we reach out into the city? So they started their church planting program. And now St. Columba's is probably double the size it was then, so from about 150 people to 300. But if you add the people who've been reached through the 4 church plants, then that's more like 750 or 800 people sort of coming through the St. Columba's sort of church planting process. So for them it's been an incredibly fruitful process. It doesn't always work like that. I planted a church from Kirkcaldy to Dunfermline, and it really gutted the church in Kirkcaldy for a lengthy period of time, but that's because I was stupid and made a lot of mistakes that hopefully I've learnt from. But that's just to say, you church, could plant a church and prosper through it rather than suffer through it. When we eventually launched away from St. Columba's, we used to meet with them on a Sunday morning, and so part of their Sunday morning congregation were people who were going to plant in Morningside. So when we left, we took 30 people away and started our Sunday worship in Morningside, and within 3 weeks those 30 people had been replaced in the seats of St. Columba's. Just it filled up again really quickly. And as you send people up, new people rise up to take on new responsibilities, use their gifts in new ways. So I think church planting can be very good. Does it work? Yes. We are reaching non-Christians. Does it work? Yes. The sending churches tend to prosper. Does it work? Yes, because the statistics I gave you earlier about which denominations are growing and which are declining show that the ones that are really aggressive about church planting are the denominations that are growing. Vineyard, Elim, FIEC, New Frontiers. Those are the denominations that have seen the most growth in the UK, and they have really high levels of commitment to church planting. The Redeemed Christian Church of God would be another example. So we believe it works, and that for us, the Free Church, we were in decline for about 40 years. We recommitted during the 2000s, we recommitted just to the idea of mission through the local church. Off of that, we've built our church planting kind of focus and vision, and from being a very slow death, we are now one of only 2 denominations in the UK that are pre-1900 denominations that are growing. So our growth is very slow, very modest, because we still have lots of decline in certain parts of our historic heartland in the Western Isles and so on, but we're growing in urban areas where people actually tend to live. So I just want to finish off really by saying urban church planting is essential to the renewal of Scotland. So I started off saying church planting in general is crucial to the renewal of the church in Scotland, but I particularly want to finish on the note urban church planting is essential to the renewal of church in Scotland. Quickly, let you know what's going on. If you want an overview, the Church of Scotland is getting in the game. Praise God for that. £25 million has been set aside by the Church of Scotland for church planting. I want some of it, but I don't think I'll get it. But hopefully they'll spend it wisely. They've been meeting with myself and lots of other people just trying to figure out what's going on, and that's great. I really hope they prosper in that process. Alan McWilliam is a very good friend of mine who's with the Church of Scotland. He leads Forge Cairn. They're seeing a lot of new pioneering missional initiatives in some churches coming out of that. 20 schemes. Andrew Robertson will be here tomorrow. Mes McConnell you will know of. The Free Church of Scotland, the Baptist Union. The Episcopal Church in Scotland is now committing to a church planting strategy through P's and G's. They've asked Dave Richards to take a lead on that. I think they're looking at what HTB have done, and they're trying to create resource churches to sustain Episcopalian mission in Scotland in different Scottish cities. The Redeemed Christian Church of God, Vineyard are doing quite a lot. Charlotte Chapel have something called the Pillar Network, which is Southern Baptist inspired. Scottish Churches Network, New Frontiers, Assemblies of God, and Elam. All these groups are involved in trying to grow their church planting witness and mission. We've come together in what we call the Scottish Church Planting Network, and we're going to have this first Scottish Church Planting Network conference in Edinburgh at P's and G's on the 26th and 27th of April this year, and you're all very welcome. That's been funded and hosted by Transform in Scotland, amongst others. And then just in city levels, I have great relationships across the board in Edinburgh. I have a little network called Generation Church Planting. The Baptists, Cairn, have Edinburgh Planting group going on. We have a collective of Edinburgh church planters. There's the Scottish Church Planting Network. So there's a whole ecosystem out there now around church planting. People who are recruiting, people who are training, people who are coaching, people who are funding. There's lots of stuff going on. And if you want to get involved in church planting, it's a totally different situation from 10, 15 years ago. Because the training and the resourcing, the insights, the expertise is there now in a way that it just wasn't. So, challenges all under the heading of P. Pipeline, okay? So, the person who coached me through all of this was from City to City, Tim Keller's church planting organisation. He was a guy called Al Barth, who was their European catalyst. And when he started coaching me, he said, your biggest challenge will be money and people. And so he said, start creating a pipeline of church planters. So we've been working on that. We run a thing called Boot Camp to raise up young leaders who will plant churches. But think about who are the young leaders you're raising up and investing in. So pipeline, pounds, okay? To plant 30 churches with the Free Church, I need to raise an initial £5 million. And so I spend a lot of my money shaking the tin, a lot of my time shaking the tin for money. So the way we do it is quite expensive. Other people have different ways of doing it. Priorities. Where are the areas of greatest need? The East End of Glasgow, housing schemes, urban areas, towns maybe that are going to be left with no viable Christian witness in the next few years. Pioneering. So Forge, Cairn tend to do a lot more pioneering stuff. Somebody starts a little business or some kind of very sort of organic thing. We tend to be more ecclesially focused in what we do. They are cheaper, lighter, more nimble. We're more expensive. But I'll be interested in the long term to see what multiplies, grows and sustains in the long term in terms of methodologies and focus. But I think there's room for everything, and the great thing about the pioneering stuff is it really does push to lead with evangelism, which I think is so important. Property, okay? We're sending all these guys out to plant churches like Haddington, for instance. They have no manse, no building, and it's a very expensive process to start buying property. Don't know. Well, I'm not going to say this actually, so okay, I'm moving on. Property, pray for property. Prayer, do pray. Because I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night panicking about all these young guys are sent out to do difficult things, and are they going to survive? And a degree of guilt. And it is a spiritual battle, and they need prayer, they need partnership, and then I would just finish with the words of Jesus. Remember the poor. I think if we want to go anywhere in Scotland in the next few decades, we've lost the working class, we've lost the poor of Scotland from the church, and that could be a great focus for what we do. Boom. Not even time for questions, so there we go. Sorry for going on so long. Hopefully you gleaned something. If you do want to ask questions, then I'm sorry.